Well, it turns out that the narrator of this particular story had to rent the only thing available, a bathroom. He said, well, look, I can't live in a bathroom. What happens when people want to take a bath? He said, look, that's all we had available. And moreover, not only did they rent the bathroom, they charged him 30 rubles, which at that time was a tremendous sum on a Soviet salary. He said, you want me to pay 30 rubles for a bathtub? You could at least give me a better price. He said, no, the committee that runs the buildings decided that. I can't change that. So, well, okay, he had a bathroom. At least he could take a bath when he wanted to, although, of course, when people came in and wanted to use the bathroom, it caused certain problems. He even tried to urge people, well, look, do it just once a week. There were all kinds of problems. Now, in addition to this, he soon met a young woman. After all, he was a young man, and they got married. So the two of them came to live in the bathroom. Of course, the woman would have liked to live in an apartment, but there was no apartment available. And of course, the other problem was the other 32 tenants of the apartment had to use the facilities, and they didn't take kindly to the suggestion that they confined to Saturdays their actions of washing and elimination. As a matter of fact, they even threatened to push in his face. Things could get very violent when people were struggling over a bathroom. Now, as if that weren't bad enough, things got even a bit more complicated when the couple had a baby. But on the other hand, there was a bright side to the situation. The infant at least experienced daily bathing, and perhaps the kid could even learn how to swim. So that they made the best of a bad situation. They coped somehow. But it was made even more complicated by the fact that the mother-in-law, that is, the woman's mother, couldn't help but want to live close to her grandchild. After all, what's a grandchild for if you can't come to the grandchild and cuddle it and hold it in your arms? So she moved in with a promise, as a matter of fact, her son, that is the wife's brother, the man's brother-in-law, would also soon join her. Imagine all of these people living in one bathroom. One of them, of course, living behind the hot water heater, another living in the bathtub, and so on. But for the brother-in-law, that was too much. Even the long-suffering narrator is not going to wait. He moves out of the apartment and away from the city of Moscow, and he's now sending his family money by mail. The wonderful quality of the story is the complete calm and matter-of-fact narration. All this is completely to be expected. Of course, what else would you expect in such a situation? And dealt with step by step as it occurs. No one think of actually complaining about it, about the fact that housing isn't available. And the contrast between the reality of the situation and the promises of socialist ideology of building a society where everybody would be in good conditions is dropped very quietly, almost unobtrusively into the story. The whole atmosphere is one of Job-like patience and the resignation to the realities of Soviet life. There's another story about housing that also provides some of the satire that Zoshchenko was talking about. It's a story called Poverty, where a man lives in an apartment that is in terrible shape. It's full of insects, the furniture is breaking down, everything is torn, nobody bothers to clean up, it's full of dust and dirt. Each individual has his own electric meter. There's a terrible, I'm sorry, there was no electricity at that time. Each person has his own apartment, his own kerosene lantern and so on, and suddenly, because there's a great program of the Soviet government to electrify the entire country, to bring electricity to all houses, they bring electricity to this house, and now they're going to have electric light. The magic of electric light is coming into the house. They press a button, and lo and behold, it's flooded with light, quite unlike the old kerosene lanterns they used to have. And good God, what that light shows! It shows the dirt in every corner, it shows the insects, it shows the torn furniture, it shows everything that's horrible to live with. Now, of course, you might think at that point that people would take steps in order to clean it up. Not at all. The landlady decides she will solve the problem very simply. She takes a scissors and cuts the cord of the electric light, and again they're plunged into darkness and use only kerosene lanterns. Now, of course, this is obviously a satire on the pretensions of the Soviet government that bringing electricity to everybody will make them clean up their lives, will make them live better lives, more rational lives, more sanitary lives. On the contrary, the old Russian intention is if something makes a difficulty, you take the easiest step to stop the difficulty, and in this case what she did was to cut the cord. Of course, at the end of the story, he says, I'm sure that there are others who would rather try to solve the problems rather than simply cut the cord, but the effect of the story is nevertheless totally clear to the reader. Now, the Soviet officials used to boast a great deal about the wide availability of socialist health care provided without any fee to the population at charge. You got medicine without any charge. There were, in fact, a number of reasons for them to take pride in the system. It is true, again, it's simply a matter of fact, that infant mortality was sharply reduced in contrast to pre-revolutionary times, and public sanitation, about which they really hadn't thought very much, was enormously improved with pipes that went underground, with the kind of toilets that were associated with, and so on. But when it came to the individual treatment of patients, there was a common popular Soviet saying, our health care is worth every kopeck. You understand a kopeck is like a penny. Our health care is worth every kopeck we don't spend on it. There were, of course, clinics that were absolutely free of charge, but to get into the clinic you had to stand in a long line, and of course when you weren't feeling well, standing in that long line was very, very difficult. Zoshchenko was something of a hypochondriac, and he knew something about Soviet hospitals. In his well-known story, The History of an Illness, he describes the first thing he sees when entering a Soviet hospital. The sign that you come in, he says, delivery of corpses 3 to 4 o'clock every Thursday. When he expresses surprise, the hospital said the patient should watch his criticism. Otherwise, he said, you yourself will be duly delivered between those hours, and you'll find out for yourself what the sign means. He says, comrades, this is no way to talk in a socialist regime to patients, but they don't pay any attention to him. The next thing that happens, they decide to take him to a washing down station. He said, look, washing down is what you do to a horse. Couldn't you think of another word for it? Couldn't you call it a bath or something like that? The nurse says, look, a guy like this is probably not going to get better anyway, so you shouldn't worry your head about such minor details. And of course, under these circumstances, the treatments go from bad to worse. Each way, the hospital staff only makes the material conditions worse by their utter indifference to the patient's welfare. They put him in a bath to be cleaned up and to be warmed up, and it turns out there's already an old woman in the bath. He said, wait a minute, you can't undress me and put me in a bath with a woman. I said, don't pay any attention to her. She's got 104 fever. She doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't even see you. So, well, all right. He manages to get into the... No sooner gets into the water, the woman says, get me out of here or I'll beat the devil out of you. It turns out that the woman does see things after all. Things become even worse when he learns from his wife that she had been mistakenly notified to pick up his dead body. This so angered him, he finally decided to complain officially, but he remembered what sorts of things happened there. He decided not to complain. He says, now when I'm sick, I stay home. What he doesn't say at the very end of the story is that in the hospital, he had picked up a children's disease. Obviously, the place was not kept in a very sanitary way. He had been put right next to the children's division, so he contracted whooping cough as an adult and had to spend an extra 3 weeks in the hospital. Eventually, he did manage to, his constitution took over. He did manage to get better, but the whooping cough went away, but instead he got pimples all over himself because of the nervousness brought on by the conditions that he had to face in the hospital. They said, look, you're a nervous type, you shouldn't go to the hospital. Both from the lightness of the humor and the lightness of potential protest against the clear absurdity of the situation, you can feel the daily circumstances of Stalin's Russia. Zoshchenko's popularity surely came both from his sharp appraisal and unique language in cutting through the absurdity of the day. He also caught the considerable courage of people caught in a whole series of daily binds, yet ready to laugh at themselves and the circumstances in their life. Now, the stories about health care in the Soviet Union did not stop just with these stories. He takes you into an office where people are waiting to see a doctor. And while they're waiting to see a doctor, each patient begins to brag about the terrible disease that he has or she has. And as soon as one person gets finished with bragging about the disease that they have, another person tries to top it. And pretty soon, they're all bragging about how their diseases are much better and much worse and much more deep and much harder to deal with than the guy next to them. And suddenly, the author says, gentlemen, ladies, what are you arguing about? Why are you doing this? Now, the Soviet Union used to brag about the fact that they had achieved complete equality for the women in their economy, that women had exactly the same jobs as men, that women were no longer regarded as second-class citizens. In many ways, there was a great element of feminism that was promulgated, particularly in the early stages of the revolution. And one of the things they used to brag about was that over 90% of their medical personnel was female. What they were trying to say was 90% of the doctors were female. What they didn't say, of course, was that virtually all of the people who were medical personnel in the Soviet Union were what are called in Russian feldsher. That is, people who had received an intermediate education, the equivalent of a high school education of some parts of medicine, who were kind of assistant doctors, what we might call nurses who had some training in the treating of ordinary diseases. And of course, if you had an ordinary disease, and this made a kind of sense in a way, if you had an ordinary disease, you went to see one of these feldshere. If you had, let's say, an ordinary flu, which could be cured very easily, if you had some kind of a cut, which could be dealt with easily, if you had anything that was a routine, ordinary, everyday, either cut or disease or some kind of problem, they could easily deal with it. Of course, if you had a more serious illness, if you had something that required a specialist, then you went beyond these feldsheres to a person who had had a higher education in medicine, what we would call an MD. But whereas well over 90% of the feldshere were women, and of course they received a very small salary. They received something like, by the days of after World War II, they received something like 30 rubles a month. In those days, it was just barely enough to live on. When it came to the doctors, to the people who when it came to the MDs, the people who had had a higher medical education, well over 90% were men. In other words, it was the same story as it had been traditionally in medicine, not only in Russia, but obviously throughout the world. Overwhelmingly large number of the genuine doctors were men. And of course, this business about 90% being women was only propaganda, which the regime was trying to promulgate in order to defend its own record in the treatment of women. This went on throughout the Soviet medical system. As I said before, to get into a clinic, you had to stand in a very, very long line. The women who had to deal with people in the clinic, of course, were trying to deal with a much, much larger number of people than they could possibly deal with in one day. The result was, of course, that their tempers became very short. And when you went into one of these clinics, I know this from my own personal experience in the Soviet Union, what you got was tremendous yelling at you, not something that was likely to cure you in a very good way. As a matter of fact, I was once told by the Russian that the way to cure an illness, of course, was to treat it with vodka. If you had a flu, if you had a temperature, if you had a fever, the thing to do was to drink vodka, and the vodka would make it go away. I wondered about this. Finally, I decided to take the problems to the doctor in the American embassy, a doctor who had been trained in the Western way, and when I saw this doctor, I said, tell me, what do you think about the treatment of illness by the drinking of vodka? He said, those guys, they treat everything with vodka. Well, I went back to my Soviet friends. He said, well, what did the Western doctors say about our treatment? I repeated his words. He said, those guys treat everything with vodka. And my Soviet friends said, he's absolutely right. That's the way we do it. It's, of course, this spirit and this attitude that Zoshchenko is catching in these stories, and he manages to catch it very well. It's interesting that comic literature, in its own way, catches everyday life much, much better than literature that takes things more seriously or literature that deals with high tragedy or high human emotions. The fact that Zoshchenko cuts through these emotions, the fact that he undercuts what they're trying to say and what they're trying to do with his own language, with his own slang, with his own very original use of language, his own very original use of the everyday psychology of Soviet people, is what made these stories so extraordinarily popular. Now, in the stories that I've talked about, he deals with problems that in some ways are not the very central problems of the human beings. To be sure, medical treatment is a very, very important thing, although the kinds of illnesses he talks about are not life-threatening illnesses. If it came to that, then people had to bribe doctors to treat their elderly relatives in a much better way, and they had to bribe them with money that was very hard to come by.